Good afternoon, good morning. Welcome to the Queen's 2020 International Institute on Social Policy. This is the 25th anniversary of the Queen's Social Policy Conference, and at no time in the past 2.5 decades has social policy been so prominent and so critical to the future of Canada and other OECD countries. The current crisis has exposed stark inequalities, the precarious nature of work, and the lack of basic social security for many. The purpose of the 2020 Queen's International Institute on Social Policy is to ask how Canada and other OECD countries can rethink critical building blocks of social policy and how we can learn from this crisis and build back better. Thank you for joining us. Today is the third of 9 moderated online sessions. Earlier this week, we heard from Darren Asamoglu on the post-COVID world. And yesterday we heard from Stefano Scarpetta of the OECD and Kevin Milligan from UBC on the pandemic's impact on different OECD countries and demographics and the policy responses of OECD countries and Canada. These sessions will be posted on the conference website by the end of the day today. To begin today, although we are not able, unfortunately, to meet in person on the Queen's campus, I would like to acknowledge that Queen's University is situated on traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. We are very grateful to be able to live and learn on these lands. Today's spotlight is on those at risk of being left behind, and it will be moderated by Denise Cole. Denise is the Deputy Minister for Seniors and Accessibility in the Government of Ontario. You can read her full bio in the conference material on the website, but let me highlight a few things for you. Denise has extensive experience in the human services sector and has worked at all levels of government in Canada. In Ontario, she has held executive positions in multiple ministries, including the Ministry of the Attorney General, Ministry of Health, and the former ministries of Children and Youth Services and Community and Social Services. She's also been an executive in the private sector and has an extensive background in community affairs, for which she has received numerous awards. So in a nutshell, Denise has a deep and broad experience with many of the issues that we're going to discuss today. So please welcome Denise Cole to moderate this session.
Thank you very much, Margaret, and welcome everyone to a spotlight discussion on those at risk of being left behind. The topic for today and the name of our session is Building Back Better, Forging a Post-Pandemic Social Contract That Works for All. This topic is of particular significance to my ministry because as a population-based ministry tasked with influencing government-wide policies and programs that impact the lives of Ontario's older population and persons with disabilities, the COVID pandemic has brought an added dimension to the work of my ministry in terms of grappling with the public policy implications of the pandemic, the disparate impact of the virus on the at-risk populations. And some of the questions that we have been grappling with are things such as how do we balance the public health precautions with the unintended consequences of social isolation? How do we grapple with the impact? We do know that our persons with disabilities do have a lower rate of employment. And so how do we think through how the pandemic has impacted their economic well-being? So I'm really delighted to be moderating today's session and really looking forward to the presentation of our 4 experts who will be giving us their insights in not only Canada, but in the US and the UK. So my role as moderator is to encourage a lively discussion of these important issues, and I will do my best to keep us on a tight timelines as we have a lot to cover. Before I introduce the presenters, let me go over a few housekeeping items. After the presentations, I will open the floor for moderated questions. And as moderator, I will be feeding through the questions, and I will read them. And to ask a question, please use the webinar's Q&A feature and type your question in at any time, and you will see this feature at the bottom of your screen. Due to time constraints, we may not be able to respond to all the questions raised, and we will try to consolidate as many of the questions as possible. For this particular session, we do have 2 hours, and so we will be dividing it up in 2 halves. The first half will focus on the Canadian experience with Rene, Morrisette, and Kerry Barasa, and in the second half, we will hear from our international presenters, Heather Boushey from the US and Laura Gardner from the UK. So after the first part, when we hear from Rene and Carrie, I will have a brief 15-minute Q&A. Then we will move to Heather and Laura's presentation, and then we will have another 15-minute Q&A following, focused on their specific presentations. And then for the remaining half an hour, we will open it up and have a free-for-all discussion with all 4 presenters. And again, I will moderate the questions. So now let's begin by me introducing our speakers. And to save time, I won't read through their biographies, but will note that they are online for your reference. Heather Boushey is the president and CEO and co-founder of the Center for Equitable Growth in Washington, D.C. Laura Gardner is the research director with the Resolution Foundation in the UK. Kerry Barasa is the director, Institute of Indigenous Peoples Health with the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. And finally, Rene Morrisette is the assistant director with Statistics Canada. And so let's jump into it, and we will start with our first presenter, Rene Morrisette from Stats Canada.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm pleased to be here today to talk about vulnerabilities in Canada before, during, and after COVID-19. Before COVID-19, Canadian families were unequal in their ability to deal with a lockdown. For example, in the absence of government transfers, 1 in 4 Canadians in working families would not have had enough savings to keep them out of poverty during a 2-month work stoppage. And some groups were particularly vulnerable. Lone mothers, recent immigrants, Indigenous people, and young, less educated families were particularly vulnerable financially. Other groups were vulnerable as well. Even among working families, poverty rates varied substantially, as you can see on the left chart. But so did the exposure to industries that ended up being severely impacted. For example, you can see on the right chart that about 15% of Filipino workers were employed in accommodation and food services, or in arts, entertainment, and recreation prior to the pandemic, which is about twice the rate observed for white individuals. There were some good news. Many Canadians, in fact, 40% of them held jobs that could plausibly be done from home. However, the feasibility of working from home varied substantially across industries and groups of Canadians. For example, the left chart shows that about 80% of workers in finance, insurance, and in professional scientific and technical services were in jobs that could be done from home. In contrast, virtually nobody in accommodation and food services were in such jobs. And partly because of these industry differences, The percentage of workers in jobs that can be done from home varied also substantially across ethnic groups, as can be seen on the right chart. Moving at the family level, lower income families and higher income families were unequal in their ability to deal with the lockdown. Specifically, lower income families held jobs that were not conducive to telework, or that were often found in industries that ended up being hardly hit by lockdowns. For example, the left chart focuses on dual earner couples and shows that among dual earner couples in the top 10% of the earnings distribution, 54% of them held jobs where both partners could work from home. In contrast, the corresponding percentage for dual earner families in the bottom decile was only 10%. So as the pandemic unfolded, many inequalities in the labor market were exacerbated. Specifically, lower wage service industries, in particular accommodation and food services, or arts, entertainment, and recreation, were highly affected. For example, as of July 2020, the number of individuals employed and working at least half of their usual hours was about 9.5% overall in the labor market, 9.5% lower than it was in July 2019. But in accommodation and food services, this employment gap, rather than being 9.5%, was much more pronounced, was about 30% in accommodation and food services. So as a result, many groups of workers, let me go back. Okay. As a result, low-wage workers have been affected much more than they were during the 2008-2009 recession. You can see that on the left charts, which plots the average monthly layoff rates of employees by wage decile, and does that for 2020, the black line, versus 2009, the red line. And as you can see, the layoff wage gradient is much more pronounced in 2020 than it was in 2009. Many groups of workers were affected. In particular, youth and less educated workers, and to a lesser extent, women and recent immigrants have been hit harder. It was also the case for temporary employees who have been hit harder than permanent employees. Generally, groups that had high poverty rates prior to COVID-19 tended to be more affected financially by the lockdowns, which is the message conveyed by the left chart. In addition, groups who had initially a large presence in low-wage service industries saw their employment rates drop more during the pandemic, which is the message conveyed by the right chart. The pandemic has also raised anxiety and concerns among multiple segments of the society. For example, crowdsourcing data from Statistics Canada suggests that the difficulty of meeting financial obligations or essential needs has risen to a greater extent among Indigenous participants than among non-Indigenous participants. And you can see that on the chart by comparing the blue bars on the left half of the chart for Indigenous participants to the blue bars on the right half of the charts for non-Indigenous participants. In a post-pandemic labor market, what are the challenges and opportunities that arise? Well, one consideration is that For those workers who have been laid off so far, the long-term financial effects of COVID-19 will depend critically on the degree to which layoffs remain temporary or conversely become permanent job losses. If you have a look at the table on the left and focus on the yellow shaded area, you will see that in the 3 previous downturns, roughly 45% of all laid off workers ended up being permanently laid off. That is, ended up losing their job, not returning to their employers subsequently. If you focus on the chart on the right, you will see that of those workers who lost their job, who were laid off permanently, at least 1 in 5 had substantial earnings declines, that is, earnings declines of 25% or more, 5 years after job loss, when employment insurance benefits no longer apply. And so because many workers who are permanently laid off end up experiencing substantial and persistent earnings decline, the degree to which the layoffs observed so far will be temporary or permanent is critical when thinking about the long-term financial effects of COVID-19. A second consideration is that even within industries, post-displacement earnings trajectories are likely to be diverse. On the left chart, we plot the average earnings of workers who were permanently laid off in 1992 or in 2009 from accommodation and food services or arts, entertainment, and recreation. And we follow workers from 3 years prior to job loss up to 8 years after job loss. The solid lines plot the earnings trajectories of displaced workers who had above median wages prior to being displaced, whereas the dotted line plot the earnings trajectories of their counterparts who had below median wages. And as you can see, even within a given industry like accommodation and food services, earnings trajectories are quite heterogeneous, with high wage displaced workers experiencing larger absolute earnings declines. And so because the post-displacement earnings trajectories are likely to be diverse, the retraining needs following displacement are also likely to be diverse. A third consideration is that the speed of the recovery in low-wage services is likely to depend to a good extent on the degree to which expected decreases in consumer spending reflect income effects, that is, reduced income, rather than health concerns. As you can see on that chart, as the economy reopens, many Canadians expect to spend less in restaurants for entertainment, recreation, and clothing compared to before the pandemic. And the degree to which these expected decreases in consumer spending are driven by reduced income rather than health concerns is going to be an important parameter. If these expected decreases in consumer spending really mainly reflect income effect, that is reduced income, the recovery is likely to be faster than if they primarily reflect health concerns. Of course, if the number of COVID-19 rises again in the fall, health concerns are likely to play an important role. A fourth consideration is that in a post-pandemic labor market, highly educated families will have 2 additional advantages. They will be in jobs, many of which can be done from home, and they will be in jobs, many of which have a low risk of being automated. So the chart on the left shows the percentage of dual earner couples in which both earners can work from home, that is the blue bars, or in which both earners have what I would call protected jobs, that is jobs that can be done from home and also that have a low risk of automation, the red bars. And as you can see, highly educated families are much more likely than less educated ones to be in jobs where both earners can work from home, or in jobs where both earners can work from home and have a low risk of automations. And these two additional advantages in the near future might put upward pressures on family earnings inequality. Finally, regardless of the configuration of telework feasibility, it's still a fact that in dual earner couples with children, women earn more than men in only a minority of couples. You can see that by focusing on the red arrow in the chart below. Between 25 and 32% of women in these couples earn more than men. And so as a result, if childcare services are not fully operational, women are more likely than men to reduce their labor market involvement to handle childcare in these circumstances. So some of the challenges and opportunities that the pandemic raise are the following. For women, the pandemic raises the question of whether it will bring women back after years of progress, or whether the natural experiments of telework and lockdown will change social norms for men and lead them to get more involved in family tasks. For disadvantaged children, it raised the question of whether remote learning will accentuate the gap between rich kids and poor kids, or whether proactive measures will be implemented to help erase the lockdown-induced disadvantage. For recent graduates and recent immigrants, raises the question of whether the entry in the labor market in a depressed period will affect adversely earnings in the long term. For workers, low-skilled workers, many of which are in jobs where tasks can be codified, it raises the question of whether the pandemic will accelerate the automation of codifiable tasks. And finally, for the telework and the transition to a low-carbon economy, it raises the question of whether there will be permanent increases in telework, and if so, to what extent these increases in telework will reduce commuting times and greenhouse gases emissions, or conversely, to what extent will this benefit be offset by movements away from public transit for workers who cannot work from home and who currently have health concern. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rene. Much valuable insights, and I think you set the stage quite well in terms of the data for what's to come. And so I will now turn to our second presenter, Kerry Barasa from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. Over to you, Kerry.
Ani miigwech. So I'm just gonna wait for my slides here, and great. So thank you, miigwech. It's an honor to be part of this panel, and thank you to Rene for his presentation. I was furiously taking notes. So again, thanks so much. I'm going to ask if you could just flip this slide for me. So I just wanted to outline at the start here, but I also wanted to introduce myself just very briefly where I'm from. I am a Anishinaabe Métis. I'm originally from Treaty 4 territory, and I live and work in Treaty 6 territory at the University of Saskatchewan. So today I'll be just, this is the brief outline, and I don't want to spend a lot of time because I'd rather be substantive. So you can see where I'm going with this today. So I wanted to start by talking about, how Indigenous peoples are impacted by systemic racism. And I wanted to start off, it's going to feel a little bit maybe the front end of the presentation, talking a little bit more about some of the issues around what the pandemic has really sort of laid bare to us. And so I promise you I will get to some potential solutions, but I wanted to sort of lay out what has really, I guess, been what's the prioritized, sort of impacted in a larger manner than what we may have thought before. And so these issues are not new, but certainly been magnified. So colonization, historical trauma, this is nothing new to Indigenous peoples. I think that, you know, many of us have been impacted by this. Residential schools, Indian Act policies, the combination of racism and sexism and the colonial policies, and the ideologies that continue to perpetuate inequalities they're not new. The problem is that COVID-19 has really heightened these impacts. And by having communities that you cannot appropriately social distance when you have communities that have you know, don't have access to appropriate health care, don't have access to potable water, not only in northern and remote communities, but even in the inner city. And we can see how very clearly how COVID-19 is really magnifying the issues. And there's, you know, many articles that have been written. There was one out of Washington Post early on in March that really set the stage for this. And if you're Indigenous, everybody knows that this is what we're experiencing. So it's important to sort of highlight that Indigenous peoples do experience the highest poverty rates in Canada. And this, you know, this was also brought up by Rene. And this trend now is happening again in a more magnified manner. Indigenous peoples, and particularly women, are vulnerable to violence, and COVID-19 again is exacerbating this. If you're in an isolation situation, you know, violence, including sexual violence, is going to be exacerbated. So systemic racism continues to contribute to limited access to culturally safe resources for Indigenous peoples, and again, particularly women. And in addition to that, of course, there is still this mentality among some of the Canadian population that still harbors this idea that, you know, Indigenous issues should be somehow downplayed or ignored, or you know, this is often attributed to the idea of white fragility. And this is something that is difficult to talk about, and certainly difficult in a short panel, but it needs to be addressed in the context of systemic racism. And systemic racism is not attributed to any individuals. It really truly is the system. You know, Canada was built upon a colonial violence, and truly it is about dismantling a system, and not about trying to really change individual attitudes. It really is about dismantling an entire system, whether it's healthcare, whether it's justice, whether it's education. And it's difficult to have these kinds of conversations, but it certainly is an absolute priority if we're really going to address COVID-19 in light of how we know that it's exacerbating these issues. So why are Indigenous peoples the most marginalized? Again, this is the context, and this doesn't mean that we blame the government for everything, and that's not how it goes. But if we don't have a context to why things are happening the way they are, and in fact, why is it that COVID-19 is exacerbating these issues, then we're never going to be able to find solutions. And so it's very important to have context. The Indian Act is not just some policy that happened, 150 years ago. The Indian Act is still very much in place. And besides the fact that we're still healing from residential school policies, from experimentation on Indigenous peoples, and we wonder then why there's some trepidation around, for example, vaccines, which we know are going to possibly save lives once the vaccine happens in COVID-19 era. Well, the fact is that we still have an Indian Act. And not only are we still healing from intergenerational trauma and historic trauma, but we are coming to terms with the fact that we still have an Indian Act that very much impacts Indigenous peoples in Canada. And I'm not going to talk about systemic racism again, but you see it there, right? It's front and center. And it is in fact, rather than, getting better, as you might think it would be getting better. In fact, it is now being exacerbated in the era of COVID-19. Many more reports of systemic racism, not only in Canada, but in all across North America and in South America, really around the world. We're seeing a lot of evidence about systemic racism. There's also a deterioration of self-determination and agency through forced assimilation. And this isn't just a historical piece. This is right here, right now in 2020. And this is linked to historic trauma and intergenerational trauma. And this has led to struggles with addictions and family violence, youth crisis, chronic poverty. But I don't want to make this a scene where this is happening in all communities, because Indigenous communities are extremely resilient, and we have a great capacity in our communities than we have ever before. But the fact is that we still have to address these historic issues that in fact are contemporary as well. Because of the fact that we haven't really fully addressed the historic traumas, and we still have treaty issues that are not resolved, and colonial policies that are still in place. And until those are fully addressed, we are going to be continually trying to address these issues. But having said that, it is very important to understand that we must take a strengths-based approach to this. It is, I think, if we're going to address this, and I don't think anybody would challenge this, it's a priority to use a social determinants approach. And so looking at some of the multifaceted layers, it is addressing some of these very key issues, food insecurity for one. And we've really seen how communities have decided to address this, and this is by going out onto the land. A lack of access to, as I said before, adequate housing and clean water in a time of COVID-19. Homelessness not only in the inner city where you might think that is the only place where homelessness is happening, and in fact it's happening in every part of the country, whether it's in the far north, whether it's in rural areas. The housing on reserve communities is also impacting, and you could say that there's homelessness as well in First Nations communities, and it is simply something that we have to be aware of and figure out how are we going to address homelessness among First Nation, Métis, Inuit communities in Canada. There's a lack of reliable and culturally safe healthcare. And what does that actually mean? It means that it isn't just about sort of having, an elder come in once a week to a community, although that is very, important, or having an elder work in a health clinic. That's important, but it is about, again, dismantling the system, dismantling the systemic racism and bias that prevent Indigenous people from attaining medical services. You know, it isn't just about the geographical distance that might prevent Indigenous people from obtaining medical care. In fact, it is about the fact that they might experience bias, discrimination, racism, and that has to be addressed. The presence of fear in accessing services is something that we often hear about from Indigenous communities, and then of course addressing and Rene mentioned this, low wages and social exclusion. So in terms of lack of access to care, you know, services with the least reliable access include emergency shelters for homelessness, as I mentioned earlier, affordable childcare, and this is becoming now more and more apparent as COVID-19 is showing us, breakfast programs for school-age children, and now, you know, we have, again, COVID-19, you know, providing us another face to how, you know, what is going to happen when, you know, the schools open, and are there going to be programs? What's going to happen to families who need to work if there's no programs in place for children? You know, will we be able to feed children and have appropriate programs? And also, of course, adult day centers as well. And what is that? How is this going to exacerbate even more than it already has in this coming wave? And so, you know, thinking about mental health care facilities is another huge challenge. And one of the issues that we've heard very clearly is looking at grief, and how grief is something that is not really being addressed. There's multiple layers of grief. Communities can't pray in the way that they need to grieve when they lose loved ones in the way they need to. Even when they're, you know, told that they need to isolate or social distance, you know, not even being able to you know, understand how to do that in an appropriate manner if they can't have the kind of housing they need to have and the supports they need to have, having the appropriate information and knowing what is culturally safe for their communities. It is extremely important to understand the complexity of these issues. And so I think the other big piece here before I talk about some of the solutions is understanding the clear correlation between poverty and the prevalence of poverty and the access to resources. So again, underfunded infrastructure, lack of access to affordable, adequate, and safe housing, the overcrowded conditions, and the lack of access to clean, potable water, and the food security. And this has been ongoing. These are ongoing issues, but certainly now magnified by COVID-19. So these inequities among Indigenous communities are now calling for increased resources and supports to communities based on the needs of equity, sustainable funding, and culturally safe services and resources. But believe me, the communities know exactly what they need. So anything that any proposals that go forward absolutely need to be driven by Indigenous communities, you know, whether they're Métis communities, Inuit, First Nations, on reserve, off reserve, and it has to be a priority that it is self-determined. It has to be driven by communities, and I can't emphasize that enough. So why have communities moved onto the land? Again, you know, this really truly is about self-determination, and they know what they need to do. So you know, this is about sovereignty, engaging in their own traditional practices. And so, you know, some of the priorities now in terms of addressing the issues, some of the issues that I've brought up, are, you know, traditional food gathering, hunting and fishing. And this also assists with, you know, the you know, high prices of food, so that it's more accessible when you can, you know, have a garden and even foraging. And then it's also the connection back to traditional teachings and practices, and assists with some of the mental health and the spiritual needs of their communities. I also think that in terms of recommendations and strengths-based ideas, these are just, you know, just the start of what actually needs to happen. But you know, really, this resonates with what Rene said, but increased participation for Indigenous peoples in the labor market is absolutely imperative, and especially for those who face additional barriers. And you know, so Indigenous women, as well as those who have disabilities or are part of the two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex and asexual community, or the 2S-LGBTQIA community. And the programs and services need to be more holistic and culturally safe. And not only that, they need to be developed by the communities themselves. You know, the programs cannot be a one-size-fits-all. That simply does not work. And it's absolutely imperative that the communities are at the heart of the development of the programs and services. And to provide adequate and stable, equitable, and ongoing funding for Indigenous-centered programs and services that are accessible, they're culturally safe, and that they meet the health and wellness needs of Indigenous peoples. And I stress this because there's so many times where I hear from community members that the programs that they end up having access to do not serve their needs. And finally, that all Indigenous communities receive immediate and necessary funding and support for the establishment of sustainable, permanent, preventative, accessible, and holistic wraparound services. And I know this is a big ask, but you know, we're in a pandemic, and we know that Indigenous peoples are one of the most marginalized communities, and that you know, COVID-19 is most definitely hitting Indigenous communities very hard. But having said that, you know, it is important to use strengths-based models, and Indigenous communities definitely know what it is that they need, and we need to respond to their needs. So, and if we want to align with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which I would highly recommend, as well as Amnesty International, sustainable funding, as I said earlier, for culturally appropriate services, but also, you know, Native Women's Association of Canada, we've been working with them, and increased capacity for recruitment of Indigenous peoples, particularly 2S-LGBTQIA, including government research, law, and health institutions, as well as education programs that will address the history of colonization and realign the services that are more responsive to Indigenous communities, and of course to uphold international human rights instruments to prevent violence against Indigenous women. And that's it for me, Miigwech.
Great. Thank you very much, Carrie. And before moving on to Laura and Heather, we will take a brief pause for some question and answers for both Carrie and Rene. I do have two questions that have already come in, and this is for both speakers. From your perspective, what is different about this economic shock versus 2008 and previous recessions, and what does this mean for policy? So why don't we start with you, Rene?
Yeah, maybe. So there are things that are common with the 2009 recession. For example, the workers that have been most likely to be laid off, both in 2008, 2009, and in 2020, were young people, were people with lower education levels, and were people with low levels of job tenure. That is, they were fairly new to the firm. And so because they were fairly new to the firm, it's probably because it's kind of a last in, first out system where because of seniority, you have a higher likelihood of job loss. So in terms of this profile in 2020 was also found in 2009. What is really, one thing that is really different is the extent to which lower wage workers in the service sector have been impacted this time. As I showed in one of the charts, I think the layoff rates for employees in the bottom 10% of the distribution were around 12–14% per month at the beginning of the pandemic, which is 4 or 5 times higher than it was in 2008, 2009. So lower wage workers and workers in low paid service industries have been impacted much more so right now than in 2008, 2009. And in previous recessions, it was workers who used to be most likely impacted were workers in manufacturing, especially in durable goods in manufacturing, and that has not been the case in 2020. In terms of the implications for policy, as everybody knows, StatsCan is not in the business of providing policy recommendations. So I'll stop here and just highlight these difference in commonalities.
Great. Merci, Rene. Carrie, anything you'd like to add?
I guess, you know, it's not my real area of expertise, but I can say when I published my book after my dissertation, we did find that in general, Indigenous peoples had, regardless of their level of education and compared to their occupation, is still Indigenous people had lower incomes. And so we had a hypothesis that really sex and race really was the two keys that we found made it so that they had lower incomes and were more likely to be laid off. So, you know, I think that that I'm not sure if that would still, I'd have to still, you know, do another study to see if that was the case, but I think that's significant. That shows that racism and sexism plays a fact in terms of Indigenous peoples and employment. And I would suspect that is still a factor today.
Great, thank you. Our next question, again, directed to both of you. There has been a lot of discussion about whether we have the data we need to really understand the COVID impacts on various racial groups and on Indigenous communities, and therefore we're less able to tailor policy solutions. What are your thoughts on that? Why don't we start with you this time, Carrie?
Yeah, I agree. It's one of the reasons that as the Indigenous engagement lead for the COVID-19 force, that we, for the first time ever, we're actually wanting to have an Indigenous led seroprevalence study. And we have been working with the other working groups to ensure that Indigenous there's a stable Indigenous longitudinal survey, so that we'll have adequate data to understand more about Indigenous peoples, because we don't have adequate data. And I think also we do need race-based data so that we can understand, you know, the COVID-19 much better. We just don't have enough data. So I think there is certainly a case to be made, and that we are trying. And I think there's other great studies out there now that are doing the same thing. And the challenge will be, can we try to somehow collate this to get a Canadian picture of it? Great,
thank you. Rene, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yes, this is an important point, and Statistics Canada is certainly aware of that, of the need for more data for different ethnic groups. And as a result, starting last July, the Labor Force Survey, which collects monthly information, which provides us every month with the information regarding the unemployment rate and the changes in employment. A new question has been introduced last month in the Labor Force Survey, which now allows us to look at the employment rates and wages of various ethnic groups, Black, Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, etc. In addition, Statistics Canada has implemented crowdsourcing initiatives where people can voluntarily provide information on various questions. Right now, I think, or maybe it will end pretty soon, there is actually a crowdsourcing initiative on perceived discrimination, where Canadians can go into our website and provide information on that and answer the questions. So this is really an important point. And Statistics Canada has been making significant efforts to fill these data gaps.
Great, thanks. Next question is directed for you, at you, Rene, but Carrie, feel free to jump in if there's something you'd like to add. Yesterday, Kevin Milligan talked about the issue of scarring. Could you say more about what we do know from previous shocks about the scarring effects on youth, Indigenous youth, and also on women if their families can't access childcare?
Well, what we know in terms, we don't know much in terms of scarring, Denise, for the groups you mentioned, Indigenous and women. What we know in terms of longer term effects is for the young graduates who entered the labor market during a recession. There's been some work by Philip Oriopoulos, my colleague Andrew Heiss at Statistics Canada, which has shown that entering the labor market in a depressed periods not only hurts your earnings in the short term as you have a hard time finding a job, but also affects adversely your earnings many years later. So the question of scarring for the other groups that have been mentioned, Indigenous people, other groups, and women are certainly important, but we have there's fewer robust evidence for these groups than we have for recent graduates.
Great, thank you. Carrie, anything you'd like to add?
No, I don't really have much to add. I mean, I do think certainly it's going to impact families and women, and we certainly have been having conversations about it. But I think that Rene had made the points I would want to make.
Great, thank you. Carrie, the next question is for you. What do you see as major opportunities and major challenges that COVID has catalyzed for Indigenous peoples with respect to their ongoing work towards sovereignty, self-determination, self-government?
Right. So I think there are some major opportunities. The challenges, frankly, I think has been has been systemic racism, and I think that is one of the major challenges, actually. But I do think that that communities now are have really, especially in the research arena. That's my area. So working in communities, I think that they're taking control in terms of research and transforming that into the programs and services that meet their needs. And so I see a lot of opportunity there, and they're really, we serve them and support them in the needs that they're looking at. But in terms of, for example, water sovereignty and food sovereignty, and those areas which are so important, particularly in the area of COVID-19. And so I think that there's real opportunities there that can strengthen governance, for example. And so I think that there's real opportunities in the research arena that you might not really think at first, like why research? But I think there's a lot of transformation that could occur there.
Great, thank you. So we'll now move on to our final two presenters. We will start with Laura Gardner from the Resolution Foundation. So over to you, Laura.
So it's been really interesting so far to hear about the Canadian experience. I'll be speaking completely from a UK perspective. Hopefully, I think definitely provides a complementary picture to what you've heard so far today. Normally I'd sort of start a presentation by talking about the outcomes in the analysis and end on the sort of needed or actual policy response. But this has been a very strange crisis in terms of kind of the speed at which it hit families and the labour market, meaning the policy response came right at the start of lockdown before we really knew quite what was going to happen. So I'll just start very briefly by setting out what we did in the UK, and I know that will contrast with what's happened in the US in particular. I'm very interested to hear about other contrasts too. So we can kind of think of our policy response in the UK in two parts. The first part was kind of two brand new schemes to support employees and the self-employed. Very briefly, we introduced a job retention scheme in mid-March, where government paid firms up to 80% of payroll costs to keep workers employed and on the books, to keep employees employed and on the books, but furloughed. So those not doing any work could still be paid most of their salary. It's been largely viewed as very successful. It was expanded to include partial furloughing, so those people who could work reduced hours and get topped up for the rest, which is more akin to some of the European schemes from July. It's now in the process of being wound down with firms contributing costs, and it will be terminated completely by the end of October, which is a lot sooner than most of the kind of wind down plans in other European countries that I know of. It's been really big, about a third of employees furloughed at some point, and the costs are pretty large. They're shown here. A week later, our government basically announced a parallel scheme for the self-employed, cash grants in this case, with a kind of a similar the same replacement rate as the job retention scheme. I won't talk in too much detail about this, but basically there were some groups that are left out of this in terms of eligibility. Some high earners, but also those who didn't have a couple of years of tax returns. They were newly self-employed. On the other hand, it's actually quite a generous scheme in that in practice, it can provide grants to kind of most self-employed people that fit the criteria, whether or not they've actually suffered an income hit. And it is quite expensive on that basis, with more than half of self-employed people having claimed in the first tranche of grants. So those were kind of brand new schemes that we invented on the fly. But the second part of the response was going to our kind of traditional levers, our benefits policy. And the main thing we did here was provide an increase to the main rate of in and out of work support. So this £20 a week increase, it feeds through tax credits or our universal credit system to both families in work and families out of work. The chart here just shows that increase makes quite a big difference to what had been a deterioration in the value of benefits over time. Welfare cuts in this country meant we've been experiencing benefits falling in relation to inflation and particularly earnings. This increase is quite a big jump up. However, it's temporary, with the plan being to reverse it and go back to where we were in April next year. Despite this chart looking quite striking, there's a huge gap between the kind of level of generosity or the replacement rate between those lucky enough to be furloughed, for example, on the job retention scheme, and those who lose their job and don't get furloughed for whatever reason and end up relying on benefits, but still a chunky amount of spending on benefits. And so kind of that all came before we knew what was happening in the labour market and more broadly. But I'll spend most of my presentation focusing on who's been hardest hit in the UK, and I think this is very complementary to what Rene's told us about Canada in particular. So before I kind of focus on the groups, the who, I think what sits behind who's been affected in the UK, and I'm sure this is true elsewhere too, is above all the hugely sectoral nature of this crisis. So the chart here, it's a little bit complicated, but it shows some sort of vaguely comparable measures from the financial crisis in the UK of the impacts across sectors, and then a measure on the right-hand side of the initial lockdown impact across sectors on output in the coronavirus crisis. And you can see written on the charts that the sort of the variation in experience across sectors is 6 times as large this time around as it was in the financial crisis. That's kind of a product of lockdown closing some sectors entirely, but allowing others to kind of jog along largely unaffected, although potentially all switching to working from home. That basically mostly explains all the outcomes we see across groups in the population. It's what sectors people work in that tend to determine the effects they've experienced so far. So that's true in relation to young people. This chart here from a survey we commissioned shows the rates of experiencing different labour market outcomes across the age range. You can see the reason I kind of had to explain the policy first is that kind of furloughing has been so successful, it's kind of dwarfed other changes in the economy. So these really high rates of furloughing across on the job retention scheme across the age range, but also, but highest for the youngest groups. And we see in particular job loss has been most prevalent for those youngest workers under the age of 25. An even clearer gradient or an even clearer stark difference is when we look at people in atypical or insecure types of work. So these are some sort of different definitions that we might think of atypical jobs in the UK. And the key point here is you can see much higher impacts in all these types of non-standard employment. So some of the numbers are really striking, a kind of a fifth of temporary workers losing their jobs, and more than 10% of 0 hours contract workers experiencing hours reductions and things like that. So that also largely draws from the sectors that have been most affected, things like retail and hospitality, and the prevalence of these types of non-standard employment in those sectors. And possibly the clearest gradient of all is across the earnings distribution. So as we've heard in relation to Canada, lower earners are much more likely to lose their job, lose hours, or be furloughed on the job retention scheme than higher paid workers. This is mixed up with the ability to work from home. And of course, as I've said, the thing that explains this all, the sectors of the economy that have been most affected by the long lockdown and are continuing to be affected by ongoing social distancing restrictions. I did want to point out though that we shouldn't think that the outcomes in relation to pay are always the same as the outcomes in relation to income. So I showed on the previous slide a very clear gradient in terms of pay. This is slightly differently set up, this chart, but this question looks across the working age income distribution, household income distribution, and looks at people's subjective assessment of whether their household income has decreased or increased as of May. And although there are differences across quintiles, with the sort of bottom and second quintile slightly more likely to say income had decreased, it's really quite even. And that's down to 2 main things. Is because lots of households in the bottom of the income distribution have adults that aren't in work, so they're just not exposed to the labour market effects. And it's because, as you'd expect, a progressive tax and benefit system does a reasonably good job of cushioning the bottom of the income distribution from some of these labour market effects, particularly as that £20 a week increase in benefits that I mentioned will benefit those at the bottom of the distribution who were already on welfare, on benefits before the crisis started, and so they might not have suffered job loss or earnings reductions, but they have benefited from the welfare boost. So that's positive, but I don't think that's the end of the story, because we have to remember that there are two halves of family budgets, and I think Rene touched on this too. This is the kind of same setup looking across the working age income distribution in the UK, but this time we're asking people how their spending has changed. And here you see a really clear gradient across income quintiles, with higher income households much more likely to have decreased their spending. And when we look at kind of how much of their spending basket people spend on essentials versus optional luxury items, things like going out to pubs and restaurants that have been restricted in lockdown, we can see that this is very likely to reflect enforced saving from reduced opportunities to spend. Now, that might not be optimal for the households that haven't been able to go out to the restaurants and so forth, but when combined with the income picture, it does mean that it's higher income households that have strengthened their overall balance sheets in the UK. And this is also reflected in other questions we looked at in our survey. So we asked families whether they'd change their rates of saving and whether they'd increase their use of consumer debt, which is what's shown on this chart here. And it was lower income families that were most likely to have reduced saving and increased consumer debt. So I've sort of gone on a bit of a journey there through pay to incomes to spending to overall balance sheets, and it is a bit of a complex picture. Really clear gradient in terms of pay and labour market effects, more neutral when it comes to income, but then the very clear differential picture in terms of consumption spending leads to the conclusion here on debt, savings and overall balance sheets, with a kind of overall resilience of lower income households more affected by this crisis as a result. So just finally on who's been affected, and then I'll take a couple of slides to wrap up with some concluding thoughts. I think it's important to point out this does sound like it might be a bit different to experiences elsewhere. Two areas where effects have really been quite even in the UK, and the first is gender, to date at least. So we did some predictive modelling at the start of the crisis that suggested that women were more likely to work in some of the sectors that would be most affected, so their jobs might be more at risk. But actually, so far, with most of the data we have, it looks like the labour market effects have been really quite even across the sexes. That is true overall, but we do see a really clear difference between mothers and fathers, and that seems to relate to who in families has picked up the burden of schools and childcare settings being closed. So that makes the gender picture here quite complex. The other thing we've been noting is that the geographical picture is also quite even. And I think this relates to the fact that the sectors that we're talking about being hardest hit, retail, hospitality, leisure services, are very evenly spread across the country. And that's a real counterpoint to, for example, the recession we had here in the 1980s, which was related to the decline of manufacturing and some heavy industries, which were really concentrated in the north of England in particular. And that meant the sectoral pattern at that time intersected with a really clear geographic pattern, whereas this time round, it seems much more spread. So these sectors are everywhere, so the effects are everywhere too. I would just point out that it's not at all clear that those patterns I've just talked about will endure. I think it's reasonable to expect the sort of next phase of this crisis to have a clearer gender divide. It looks like one of the reasons why there wasn't in the early phase was the construction, a very male industry here, took a huge hit, but it's bounced back pretty quickly too. And some of the kind of longer term shifts we're seeing in retail, for example, one of the sectors that has been quite affected, look like they're going to affect kind of shop floor jobs, which are typically done by women, more so than kind of distribution, servicing, online retail that are jobs more typically done by men. Additionally, history suggests that in the recovery phase of crises, you do start to see these geographical divides open up as historically weaker areas take longer to recover. So that is a hopefully informative whistle-stop tour of how the impacts have been felt in the UK so far and who's at risk of being left behind. I will very quickly wrap up by talking about what next. I've only got 2 more slides. So I just thought I'd sort of provide our kind of overall message at the Resolution Foundation in terms of where we are in in this crisis in the UK, which is that partly due to the success of some of the policies the government's introduced, like the job retention scheme, we haven't actually seen any change in unemployment at all so far during this crisis. Our unemployment rate is still hovering around 2%. I know that's very, very different to the US, at least, for example. We have seen big reductions in hours, people who say they're still employed but aren't working any hours because of furloughing and people being off sick and self-isolating and stuff, but we haven't seen those headline labour market measures really budge yet. And that's led some to be pretty chirpy and optimistic in the UK, but we are still really worried. We're really worried about the autumn. I mentioned that our job retention scheme is being withdrawn quite rapidly through to October, and there is a really big concern about redundancy of furlough driving up unemployment here very quickly, and that's what this chart speaks to. It shows that a pretty significant minority of those on furlough, when we surveyed them, expect to lose their jobs, which that sort of proportion could easily add 1 or 2 million to our unemployment numbers. And our fiscal watchdog is still projecting very, very high unemployment towards the end of this year, tripling up to around 12%. So I think the message there is we feel like in some senses policy's done a good job so far in the UK, but that shouldn't lead us to rest on our laurels, particularly as that policy is now being scaled back quite quickly while lots of the challenges of the crisis are still with us. So kind of finally, what can we kind of conclude about those at risk of being left behind in the UK? I think the sort of concentration of the effects in the labour market on lower paid workers in the hardest hit sectors means that those are the people we should be worried about in terms of the redundancy risks that we still feel are coming in the autumn. We're particularly worried because that group is low qualified, it has low travel to work distances, and so may find it hardest to find new jobs. We talked about scarring in the previous session. We've done quite a bit of work on the risk of unemployment and pay scarring for those who leave education into a recession. It's pretty clear that that's going to be even worse this time around than last time. And I think we should be, given what I've said about income, spending, debt and saving, we should be particularly concerned about the resilience of lower income households whose balance sheets have been worsened during this crisis in comparison to higher income households. So what do I think the UK government should be thinking about? I think the furlough scheme is being withdrawn too quickly in the hardest hit sectors, and we need to mirror the likes of France and Germany and extend that longer, at least in some sectors. And then I think that will need to be followed up by some sort of wage subsidy type support in those sectors for as long as social distancing remains a supply constraint. I think we've done far too little to support job reallocation to other sectors, particularly that these kind of largely lower qualified workers in the hardest hit sectors could access. So things like social care and green jobs and things like home retrofitting, they're spread across the country. They're reasonably accessible without high qualification requirements, and they're things that government can spur via investment, and there are social and kind of ethical and environmental reasons for doing so. And finally, I think this crisis has just kind of recovered our rate of benefits, as I showed you on my first chart, that had been deteriorating for decades. I think reversing all of that next April, the crisis will be far from over, and that will be far too soon and hit the incomes of lower income families particularly hard. So our kind of top policy call at the moment is having done a good job on raising welfare support for those families most in need in this crisis, don't take it away. If you're going to take any of it away, April is far too soon. So I hope that was an informative whistle-stop tour of what's going on in the UK. I will stop there and look forward to finding out how things are looking in the US.
Thank you very much, Laura. That was quite insightful, comprehensive, and good comparisons between the Canada and the UK. I will now turn it over to Heather Boushey from the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. Over to you, Heather.
There we go. So thank you so much. It's just a real pleasure to be here. These have been just fantastic presentations. I've learned a lot about both Canada and the UK today, and the Native peoples up in Canada, and really appreciated the conversation so far. Really excited to be able to close it out with the case of the United States. Before I get into the conversation today, I wanted to take a few moments to just talk, just give you a little bit of an introduction of who I am. We're going to talk a little about the most pressing problems facing the United States as a result of the coronavirus crisis, provide a little bit of a roadmap. But a lot of the work that I'm going to talk to you about today is based on work that I've done as leader of, co-founder and leader now of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. We launched back in November of 2013 with the goal of advancing evidence-backed ideas and policies in pursuit of growth that is strong, stable, and broadly shared. And we do this through a very unique institutional strategy in that we fund academics to investigate questions of whether and how economic inequality in all its forms affects economic growth and stability. So to do this, we have an open and competitive grant program, and we are now in our 7th grant making cycle. We've given away about $6.5 million to over 250 world-renowned scholars. And I want to start there because we've spent this last 7 years really trying to understand the effects of inequality on growth and stability. And in many ways, that research is really made for this economic moment. As we look at the economy, I want to encourage us all to start with the economic context and focus on what today's distribution of economic resources and with it economic power means for today's families and today's businesses. So when we start with these questions about who enjoys economic income and what they do with it, that puts human decision-making in the driver's seat of our economic momentum and of the story about what we can do about it. So I like to start there because I think it grounds our conversation in our capacity to make change rather than assuming that these are just trends that, or occurrences that we have no control over. So in the United States, the coronavirus and the ensuing shutdowns have led to the end of the longest economic recovery in recorded US history and the end of this decade-long economic expansion. And before we start talking about the pandemic and what happened in 2020, I want to start by just reminding everybody that the gains from economic growth in the United States were not shared prior to the pandemic. And that what we know from the economic evidence is that that left our economy and our society more vulnerable to experiencing this economic shock in really negative ways. So in the year prior to the crisis, even as top-line economic markers were really great, we had historically low unemployment and we had GDP, gross domestic product, growing about 2% per year. This wasn't enough to actually see strong income gains all across the income spectrum in the ways that we would have expected given the strong growth and the low unemployment. What we were seeing is that the growth just wasn't equitably shared. So I want to start with a few charts that ground this conversation. So the first one that I want to show you is I want to start by looking at the period from 1963 to 79. So what this shows you across the x-axis is income, family income of US families across the axis going from low to high. And on the y-axis, we see income growth. And what you can see clearly is over the decades of the 60s and 70s, the United States was a nation where incomes were growing together. That is, as the economy grew, and it grew, that purple horizontal line is average growth, incomes grew fastest for those at the lowest in the end of the income distribution and grew slowest for those at the top. So really a nation growing together. What we see since then are 3 distinct trends that really ground this experience we've had in 2020. So the first trend, and one that we don't talk about enough, is that economic growth has been slower in the United States since 1980. So nationally, income growth between 63 and 79 was 1.7% per year on average. In the period since 1980 going through 2016, which is the latest that this data was, it was about 1.3%. So we've seen a slowing of economic growth, but we've also seen 2 distinct trends. And you can see them both in this figure. So again, this is the same income distribution on the x-axis and income growth on the y-axis, with that purple bar being that average 1.3% per year growth. You can see that the United States has become shockingly this nation where incomes are growing apart. So as incomes grew between 1980 and 2016, those at the top have seen far higher income growth than everyone else, and those at the bottom have seen the slowest income growth. Indeed, in the United States, since 1980, on average, only those in the top 10% have seen their incomes grow above average growth. So really, we're a nation that's growing apart. Another statistic that we talk about a lot in the United States that really illustrates this is that if you were born in the 1940s, your probability of out-earning your parents was about 90%. About 9 in 10 kids grew up to out-earn their parents among those born in the 1940s. Among those born in the early 1980s, only about half of people are growing up and out-earning their parents as adults. This is a remarkable shift in a fairly short period of time. So our work at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth has been seeking to understand what these trends in inequality mean. And I want to draw your attention to 3 conclusions. So the first is that we see that this high economic inequality constricts growth by obstructing the supply of people and ideas into the economy, limiting opportunity for those not already at the top, slowing productivity growth at the time, but also creating vulnerabilities for folks that are not at the top of the income ladder. Second is that we've seen this high economic inequality is subverting the institutions that manage the market, which has made our political system more polarized, more dysfunctional, and also have made our markets less economically competitive. And then finally, these trends in economic inequality and what they've done in terms of obstructing the supply of people and ideas and subverting our institutions have created distortions in both consumption and investment that have led to that slower growth, but have also created fragilities across families. So I'll come to this in the end in terms of the policy recommendations, but what we've learned here is that we really need to constrain inequality at the top and provide counterweights to concentrated economic power. So one way that we think that we need to do this is to make sure that we change the way that we measure economic growth. So these are my last 2 slides, and then I'll focus a little bit on the COVID crisis. So if you sort of think about economic growth over time, you see, I'm showing this chart, which shows from 1963 to 2018, economic growth year over year, annual gross domestic product. It's actually national income growth, which is akin to GDP, a few technical differences. But we see this aggregate growth over time. We have been arguing that in order for policymakers to understand the implications of inequality and how to prepare our economy for the kinds of shocks that COVID has brought and the kinds of shocks that we know are coming down the pipeline in terms of climate change, we need to change how we measure growth and look at it in terms of disaggregating it. So as this chart shows, since 1980s, if you allow your eye to be drawn to the red bars, that is the income year over year that went to the top 1% of US households, US taxpayers. The orange bars are the next 9%, and the yellow is the top 40%. So the blue is the bottom half of the US income distribution, which, as you can see from this visual, has been getting less and less of the total gains of economic growth. So this kind of trend has made our economy less resilient to shocks. So starting from this point, when the coronavirus hit our shores, we at Equitable Growth predicted that there were 5 distinct ways that the United States would experience a crisis that was deeper and more protracted than our economic competitors. And I'm terribly sad to say that for the most part, we have been correct. We all know, I'm sure that many of you have seen the figures and the charts that show that the United States has had much higher death rates and much higher cases of the coronavirus relative to other countries. And that's sort of the foundational first data point. But so let me go through these 5 predictions briefly and then talk about where we need to go. So first, we predicted that the crisis would be deeper and more protracted because of these decisions that we'd made over the past half century that made our economy less effective in good times and less resilient. And we have left too much of the job of governing to the market rather than to the capacity of policymakers to enact policies for the benefit of us all. One way that we saw this particularly playing out is that we predicted that in the United States, places that had paid sick days and paid family medical leave. So just a sidebar here, unlike our economic competitors in the UK and Canada, unlike other countries, the United States stands virtually alone in workers not having the right to a paid sick day so they can stay home if they are sick, or to paid family leave. So what that meant is that when the coronavirus happened in the United States, you had millions of workers who were afraid to stay home. They might have had a cough, or they were a little bit sick, but felt, oh, okay, I'm okay enough to go into work. And of course, we know that that transmits the virus. We know from research in the United States that mandated that the places, so we have some cities and states that have put into place this policy, and we know from research on that those places that have mandated sick leave reduced the rate of the flu transmission during the last crisis, the H1N1. They reduced it by as much as 40%. And so we think that one of the reasons that cases were so viral here in the United States is because of this lack of paid sick days. And this, of course, this lack of this policy is part of a pattern in the United States in which the United States lags behind economic competitors in terms of ensuring that workers have access to what they need to be healthy. Third, in terms of our predictions, we expected that many workers in the United States would fear going to the doctor because of the high cost of healthcare in the United States. And, it wasn't until March that the US Congress actually ensured that coronavirus tests would be free for people. And yet we still know that there are still too few tests available. And we also know that many workers, even if the test is free, have been slammed with high medical bills. There's been a series of stories in the papers talking about this issue. And of course, nearly 28 million Americans lack access to health insurance, and most of those are low-wage, self-employed workers or gig workers. All of this makes the coping with a pandemic that much more difficult and that much more challenging. Fourth, we expect that the crisis would be deeper and more protracted in the United States because we lack a robust social insurance system to deal with economic crises. And I will point here to the fact that we have in the United States, our unemployment insurance system is actually 53 systems, one for every state in the United States and also for the Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, and okay, I'm forgetting one. Oh, and the District of Columbia. So each of these is its own system. And unfortunately, especially over the past decade, since the Great Recession, these systems have been underfunded and weakened in many ways, let alone the fact that in many places, the states have made it more difficult to receive benefits, and benefits aren't enough to make ends meet. So when, as a part of the legislation to expand benefits in March, Congress increased the amount of benefits for workers on unemployment. Many of the states have had an incredible difficulty pulling people into the program, getting them benefits in a timely manner, and administering these higher benefits. On top of it, we have not solved the problem of workers like gig workers whose employers have not been paying into the system, and at the beginning of the crisis were not eligible for these benefits. Congress fixed that, but these remain ongoing problems. And while we're seeing ongoing, week after week, record numbers of people applying for benefits, and as of now, about 27 million people are on unemployment benefits, this remains a challenge because at the end of July, Congress actually pared back the additional benefits that workers would receive. I see Denise there, so I will, I've just got a couple more points and then I will wrap up. So these are some of the reasons that we expected the crisis would be more protracted in the United States. I want to show one final chart that I think gives an indication of where we are now. So given the backdrop of higher inequality, given the backdrop of the dysfunctional and lack of a robust social insurance system, which of course means that we don't have the kinds of automatic stabilizers we need in place to really, without an act of Congress, provide that macroeconomic benefit that we need so much. What we have been seeing over the past few months is that what we have done in terms of relief has led to a very bifurcated economic recovery. No, I guess I didn't. Oh, there we go. Where we see that while the economy has come back for high wage workers, for low wage workers, and this is just one of a gazillion charts, technical term, that I could show you, sort of showing the bifurcated recovery we've seen here in the United States. This is from Opportunity Insights, that workers in high wage jobs have seen their jobs come back for the most part. The high wage employment is down only by about 0.5%. Whereas those in low wage employment are still seeing their employment levels down by about 16%. This is through early June or early July. So in terms of the kind of recovery we need to see in the United States, it remains the case that the number one thing policymakers need to do is to contain the virus, make sure that there's adequate testing, contact tracing, and the like. Economists have been saying, just until we're blue in the face, that we can't solve our economic problems until we deal with and contain the virus, as other countries have been able to do. Second, we're going to continue to need to extend relief to workers and families and small businesses who are in great need. The benefits that Congress did put out, many of them expired at the end of July, and Congress has been unable to continue those benefits. They've been unable to come to a deal. While at the same time, the Federal Reserve continues to prop up the economy, but many of those benefits are accruing to the highest wage workers and to the highest paid, to the firms at the high end of the economy. And then third, as we're thinking about a road to recovery and how we're going to build back better, we need to have a few things in mind. First, we need to make sure that we understand that this plan needs to contain high-end inequality and provide counterweights to concentrated economic power. We need to focus on the scourge of racial injustice. We need to make sure that we are preparing ourselves for the next crises coming down the pipeline, be it another pandemic, or more likely, I think, issues related to climate change. We have a hurricane hurtling towards the southeast of the United States as we talk today. And we need to make sure that we are providing the foundations for a strong and stable recovery through shoring up our automatic stabilizers, through ensuring that there is tax revenue by pulling in taxation at the top and undoing the tax cuts for the top that we did in 2017, and making sure that families have access to the benefits that they need. I will stop there, as I could go on and on about the policy agenda, but I'm very excited to hear questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Heather. Lots of many questions rolling around in my head. We'll take a few minutes for some targeted questions to both Heather and Laura, and then in the remaining time we have left, open it up for some general questions. We have about 20 minutes left. The first question for both speakers, can you speak to the response of the population regarding the government taking on debt or taking on these social interventions regarding the longevity of the economy? Do you think this is really delayed pain? So who wants to start? Laura, you look like you're poised to go.
I'll give it a go. That's kind of a debate that's starting to swirl around in the UK. I don't know if I'm going to provide the response of the population or the response of economic researcher such as myself, but maybe I'll start with what I think and then end on where I think the population is at. So very quickly, I think lots of that started to crop up, you know, like debates in our newspapers about how are we going to find all the money to pay for all this stuff? Isn't it time to kind of tighten the belt, that kind of thing? We and others have been arguing quite strongly that the biggest damage you can do to the longer term public finances is destroying otherwise viable economic relationships, productive firms, productive jobs, and so forth. So doing all these things like our job retention scheme is, up to a point, the best way to protect the long-term public finances, even if that costs a lot of money. So we've been arguing that it's not yet the time to think about public finance consolidation. That will come, but we need to kind of secure the recovery first. The debate that has been happening in the public in the UK is we will have to get some of that structural deficit down, maybe not this year, but starting next year perhaps. How do we do that? And I think where there is public salience on this issue is the fact that in the UK we've been through a decade of austerity, so reduction of the deficit mainly via spending cuts. We are arguing quite strongly, and I think public sentiment is with us on that, that to the extent that we need to get this debt down, and we should remember that borrowing is currently very low, so there's not, our debt servicing costs have actually gone down in this crisis, not up, despite the higher spending, because interest rates and inflation have fallen even further. So this isn't like a right now challenge, but it is a long-term challenge. It needs to be tax rises rather than spending cuts that bear the burden of the consolidation when it comes. And you do see that in public sentiment in the UK. A decade of austerity has made people weary of further spending cuts. And most of the polling suggests that people aren't generally up for their own taxes rising, but there is public sentiment for tax rises bearing the burden in general.
Great. Thanks, Laura. Heather?
Yeah, so here in the United States, the question of austerity is, here also it's starting to rear its ugly head. Here's the thing. In terms of the economics, there is no reason for us to be worried about debt or deficits right now in terms of what we need to do to address the coronavirus and in terms of what we need to do to provide relief to workers, to families, to small businesses and the like to get the economy back on track. We have historically low interest rates, which means that the burden in terms of debt payments is still fairly low. And it also indicates that there is no, what economists would call crowding out happening as the government borrows. It's not the case that there's evidence that for every dollar that the government borrows, that some private firm is not getting access to capital they need. Given that we have low interest rates, there's a lot of money tracing too few opportunities for investment. So in fact, this is an excellent time to take on debt to do what we need to do to shore up the economy. I think moving forward, as we start to talk about recovery plans and how we're going to build back in the years to come, in the United States, we have created a very lopsided tax structure. On the one hand, we have consistently, decade over decade, been giving these massive tax cuts to families at the very, very top of the income distribution. The American people were told that if we did that, that would unleash all of this growth. That's why I showed you that chart that since 1980, when we started cutting taxes at the top in very robust ways, we've actually seen slower income growth year after year than in the decades before when we had higher tax rates. So there isn't a lot of evidence that that is the solution to what ails us. And at the same time, the United States has done a relatively poor job of ensuring that corporations pay their fair share. We have a high level of corporations essentially avoiding taxes by the ways that they're parking dollars overseas in tax havens and the like. And so I think there's a lot of room for us to think about ways to raise taxes that will be equitable, that will be able to finance what we need to do, but at the same time will also help us focus on getting all of that excess wealth that we have flowing through our society focused on the kinds of investments that are going to lead to stable, broad-based growth. So if we focus on taxing at the top, it's a win-win, not just for equity and not just for financing things, but for financing them in a way that will actually put us on a more stable, more secure path moving forward and bring in those dollars from the wealthy that right now can't seem to figure out what the most productive investment they can be investing in.
Right. Thank you, Heather. Next question is for both of you. Given the overwhelming evidence that recent graduates entering the workforce will experience scarring from the economic shock for a longer period of time, what are some possible policies to support them and to mitigate the economic consequences for this group? Why don't we start with you this time, Heather?
Oh, what a super important question. And, you know, I just think of all the folks that I know that lived through the Great Recession, graduated in school, you know, or were in school or at the early parts of their careers, struggled through that, and now we're also dealing with this second crisis in a decade. And we do know from the Great Recession that the scarring effects are real, that these leads to lifetime differences in people's earnings. And you think about those kids who graduated from school this past May, who may not be getting the kind of job that they would get in a normal recovery, and yet next year's graduates they will also be competing with, and the year after that, which is what we saw before. So I think it's a great place to start. So we need to make sure first and foremost that for those who are graduating, they have access to the income support and the benefits that they need to make ends meet. We could be doing more to alleviate their student debt burdens. We could be doing more to ensure that they're not getting evicted from their rental apartment. We could be doing more, especially for the ones that have children, in ensuring that they have access to care for their kids. So if they do have a job, they're able to go there, and that care is enriching and safe and affordable. I think that the other thing we need to be really focusing on is that this isn't just a problem for right now. This is a problem for years to come. So really making sure that we're shoring up the economic security, the group of policies for economic security for young people needs to be a top priority. And we need to make sure as we're doing that we have an attention to the ways that this is going to fall most heavily on young people of color. So you think about, you know, kids, you know, young Black kids or Latino kids who are graduating into this economy and not seeing that economic opportunity. So really pairing that with a racial justice agenda is imperative.
Great. Thanks, Heather. Laura?
Yeah, really important question. Echo what Heather said on evidence of kind of long-term scarring if you're unlucky enough to leave education and begin your career in previous downturns. So we should be really worried about this time, particularly because in the UK at least, most young people, even university graduates, but young people with lower education, start their career in one of those lockdown sectors. So most non-graduates in the UK, their first job is in retail or hospitality, and those are the sectors that are particularly affected. So really briefly, what should policy do? We have actually done some stuff in the UK. There's been a scheme launched called Kickstart, which is a job guarantee scheme. So firms paying the government paying 6-month minimum wage jobs created by firms. We think this is a really good idea. There was a similar scheme called the Future Jobs Fund in the previous crisis that, although it's quite expensive, was shown to have really big additional effects on young people's chances of finding sustainable employment. So it's great they've kind of reintroduced something like that. It's going to be a real challenge to get off the ground at the scale needed because they're quite reliant on local government to deliver it, and that's been kind of really affected by the austerity I was speaking about. But you know, those kind of expensive interventionist job guarantee policies you can't do them across the economy, but I think there's a really strong case of focusing them on young people at risk of long-term unemployment. And the other thing we highlighted, given all this evidence that if you leave education and start your career in a downturn, you can be scarred for years to come. What about giving people more opportunities to stay on in education and kind of ride out the worst of the storm, if you like? So we've advocated for an expansion in maintenance support for vocational qualifications and a few things like that, so that those young people who'd rather kind of stay out of the worst of the crisis and up their skills a bit more can do so and hit the labour market when things are a bit rosier. Weirdly, we've had an absolute fiasco with the school exam results in the UK over the last couple of weeks, and one of the consequences of that is our government has had to kind of lift the cap on university places because they kind of messed everything up basically. So that policy actually kind of happened by a really weird and backwards route, which was not at all what was planned. But maybe that's a happy accident of totally messing up what's called A-level results in this country. The high school diplomas basically. Yeah, we've kind of done that back since. So we're doing some of it in the UK. It'll be hard to get off the ground, but staying in education and job guarantees, I think are the kind of expensive interventions that are really needed for that group at risk of scarring.
Great, thank you. Next question. Can you speak to the relation between race and economic inequality in the UK and in the US? You've touched on that somewhat, but here's an opportunity to elaborate. So who wants to start?
There's so many places to start this, but let me just focus on sort of what's happened over 2020. I think one of the things that has really been so profound is that while we know that there are these economic inequalities, we know that they play out across race. One of the statistics that really, for me, was eye-popping, and it's going to sound a little bit odd as I explain it, so just bear with me for the whole couple of sentences. Typically, whenever you have an unemployment rate for white people in the United States, the unemployment rate for Black people is about double. Right? So if the unemployment rate for white people is 4%, for Black people, it's 8%. And this has been something this was a trend that I learned when I was in graduate school, and I had sort of been a constant my entire career. When we got the first month's data on the rise in unemployment in the United States post the coronavirus, there was this sort of very surprising statistic, which is that yes, Black unemployment had risen fast, and it remained higher than white unemployment, but it was only about 1.5 times higher. And I looked at that statistic and I was like, wow, is that good? Is that bad? And of course, on the one hand, that's a good thing, right? We don't want this double high unemployment rate. It would have been even higher than what it was. But what it actually meant is that because of the segregation in our labor markets, so many people of color are employed in jobs that were quote unquote essential. They're bus drivers, they're retail workers, all across our economy. So that number, which on the one hand could have been seen as a win, was actually a horrifying number because it was part and parcel to why deaths and sickness from coronavirus has been so much higher in communities of color in the United States. And so I've been sort of, carry this around, as we as economists, we get really sort of attached to these numbers that have all of this emotional content, and people can think we're a little bit strange that there's so much emotion attached to this. But for this one, this number for me is just, it's a very sort of deep number that shows both the segregation, it shows the discrimination that happens in our economy, but also just underscores how fragile and how vulnerable communities have been in this. So there's a lot of different things that we could be doing to address racial inequality in the United States, but I think that certainly it starts by ensuring that every single worker in our country has access to a safe working environment, that they have access to paid sick days, paid family leave, health insurance, along with a decent paying job. One of the things that we saw horrifyingly over the spring and early summer was report after news report of workers at their place of work in, nursing assistants in garbage bags because they didn't have protective gear to protect themselves from the coronavirus, which of course was connected to the high rates of infection. And so I think that moving forward, one of the most important things that we need to do is to make sure that we are creating safe workplaces, and that will disproportionately affect workers of color. There are a gazillion other policies that we could be focusing on, but let me just stop there and allow Laura to talk about the UK experience.
Great, and Laura, we have about 5 or so minutes left, so if I can ask you to keep your response as brief as possible.
Can definitely do that because I was going to say really similar things to Heather. The ethnic mix in the UK is obviously different, and we have a large Asian and Asian British population alongside a Black and Black British population, and on many economic measures, it's the Asian and Asian British population that perform worse than the Black and Black British population because of kind of the time at which those communities historically came to the UK, and exactly the same thing as Heather said. We didn't see the kind of level of divide we expected to, and one of the in the labour market outcomes, although we have seen Asian and Asian British people in particular be more likely to lose their jobs than Black and Black British people, and one of the key reasons for that is ethnic minority communities in the UK are very likely to be key workers alongside multi-generational living, overcrowded housing and so forth. That seems to be one of the key drivers of why we have such big differences in infections and death rates. So I actually think it's the health. I mean, the two things are linked, as Heather and I've described, but it's the health outcomes, not the economic outcomes, that are most stark by race and ethnicity in this crisis.
Great. Thank you. And I think we have time for about one more question, and I will invite Carrie and Rene to turn your cameras on in case you want to comment on this. But the next question is Darren Ace, I'm going to mangle the last name, so apologies. Acemoglu from MIT spoke on Tuesday about the institution and policy bias toward automation, which has disadvantaged labor. He gave the US example that labor was taxed more than capital, depreciation allowances. So is economic and innovation policy part of the problem and or the solution?
Maybe I can say a few words,
Rene?
but yeah, maybe I can say a few words about that. I guess the results so far, the evidence is that the some types of automation, in particular reprogrammable robots, have had some negative effects on employment, especially in the United States. And one of the things I think that is lacking right now in terms of the discussion is that we take technological change in automation as given, as something exogenous over which authorities have no control. And actually, Daron Acemoglu and Pascal Restrepo actually wrote in many papers on that. One of them was about the wrong type of AI. And one of their points is that there's actually very little discussions about which types of artificial intelligence of automation governments should foster, should stimulate. Some types of automation will increase demand for labor, whereas obviously other types of automation will reduce the demand for labor. So I think right now, certainly when thinking about that, it would be useful to have more discussion about the possibility of government authorities to think about which types of artificial intelligence, which types of automation perhaps they should foster in an effort to boost labor demand, both in the short term and in the longer term.
Right.
Let me just,
go ahead, Heather.
Yep. Yeah, let me just add just one point on this. I have not seen the paper that you're referring to by Daron, but I did listen today to the Federal Reserve Board's Jackson Hole meeting, and one of the papers that was talked about there, consistent with a lot of research that's been emerging, is the intersection between the high concentration across the US economy, across firms, and what that's done to innovation and to technological development. And so I just want to kind of pull out that, one of the trends that we've seen in the United States is, a rising inequality across incomes, across wealth, but also across firms, and that there's increasing evidence that that concentration across firms is actually changing the way innovation happens in ways that is leading to less of it and to less investment. And so as we're thinking about a robust recovery in the US, we need to be very thoughtful about how we're thinking about market structure, about how we are unpacking that greater concentration if we want to see the kinds of innovation that has driven economies in the future. That's more on the investment side than on the labor side. But I do think that with proper labor standards, we can weather changes in innovation, and workers can gain from them in terms of better wages and working conditions and benefits.
Could I just add something really quickly? I'm not an expert in this field, but I can say when it comes to AI and innovation for Indigenous communities, I think one of the major barriers isn't that Indigenous communities don't want to be engaged. It's that if you're living in remote or rural areas, try and get appropriate access to any kind of technology. We've been working on dementia projects, for example, with Indigenous communities, and they're very excited to work with technology. But we had to buy boosters and do workarounds because they don't have appropriate access. And I think that's something that that's really the government's role, to make sure that they have access to technology so that they can work from home, or they can play a role in the economy when it comes to technology. I don't think that there's a real fear of technology. It's more that they need to have access, and we know that's a huge issue. That's not just for employment, or it's also, you think about telehealth and access to healthcare remotely and all those other issues that really need to be addressed. And I just wanted to put that out there because I think for Indigenous peoples in particular, at least in Canada, that's a huge barrier.
Okay, great. Thank you all very much. I am going to wrap it up there. I would like Queens to invite me back at some point in the future to moderate, so I will make sure that I keep us within our time slot. So a heartfelt thanks to Rene, Carrie, Heather, and Laura for some really insightful presentation. I've found it very thought-provoking, lots for me to mull around over the next while as my ministry supports the government in thinking through what an appropriate response to the pandemic needs to be, particularly for the populations that my ministry is focused in on, so that no one truly gets left behind. And I will now hand it back to you, Margaret, for a wrap-up.
Thank you very much. Well, let me add my thanks to our terrific speakers, Rene, Carrie, Laura, and Heather, and also to Denise for moderating, as Denise said, an extremely thought-provoking and stimulating session. So thank you all very much. Thank you to our participants, hundreds of you, and thank you for the questions that you submitted. I think we had a great discussion. So the conference will resume next Tuesday on September the 1st at 12 noon Eastern Daylight Time, with, I think it's fair to say, a much anticipated and timely session on rethinking income protection. As we've discussed today, the current crisis has heightened concerns about gaps in coverage, inequities and inefficiencies in the current patchwork of income security measures in Canada and other OECD countries. So we've had emergency measures, as we've heard today, income benefits, wage subsidies, and they've been quickly introduced to help keep individuals and families and businesses afloat. But as we move into the fall, as we move into the recovery phase, as these emergency measures wind down, the question becomes, as I think some of our speakers said today, well, can public policies be designed that are more equitable in their coverage and better suited to the contemporary nature of work? So in our discussion earlier this week, Stefano and Kevin Milligan started to outline some of the critical issues, and we had some of them again today. So next week's session is designed to dive into these issues in more detail. We will hear from 3 leading experts: Hilary Hoynes, who's a professor and the Haas Distinguished Chair in Economic Disparities at the University of California, Berkeley; Miles Korak, who's the professor at the Stone Center on Socioeconomic Inequality at the City University of New York; and David Green, who's a professor in the Vancouver School of Economics at the University of British Columbia. And this session will be moderated by Mark Stabley, Stone Chair Professor in Wealth Inequality at INSEAD in Paris and an expert on these issues in his own right. So please join us. Please sign on using the unique URL that you received in the confirmation email that you received when you registered. This is the same URL, a link that you used today and that you will use for all the sessions. So before closing, I'd just like to acknowledge and thank our sponsors: Employment and Social Development Canada, the Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services Ontario, and the City of Toronto. Without their support, we would not be able to bring these critical issues to you and to have this large Canadian gathering for this online conference. So thank you very much.